Okay, it says we are live. Okay. Hoping we are. Yes, all right. There we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this social justice and the gospel event. I'm J.R. Forasteros. I'm going to host this evening, and we have lined up an incredible panel for you. And our goal tonight is largely to just celebrate what the good news of Jesus means in our lives in a very public way. Kathy, Khang, and I were talking a little bit earlier, and she said there are other panels, and I think she called them manels. That's when a panel is all men. That happen a lot of times where you only hear from kind of one perspective, and it ends up feeling so limited. And so we wanted to create this event as a way to celebrate the diversity of perspectives and witnesses to Jesus's good news. And so tonight you're going to hear from a whole bunch of people, and we're just asking the question, what does our faith look like in the public world? So I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists and asking each one of them to share a little bit of their faith story. So first up, we have Dr. Michelle Reyes. Michelle is a PhD, pastor's wife, bridge builder, literary enthusiast, Red Bud writer. She and her husband, Aaron, run the blog The Art of Taleb. She is a regular contributor for Encourage, Think Christian, and Church Health Reader, and she is the mother of two littles. So Michelle, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us just a little bit about your faith story.
Yeah, so I'm a bicultural Indian American woman, and I grew up in a home with a Caucasian father and an Indian mom. And, it's interesting, when my mom and my dad first married, my mom was still a Hindu. And I still remember when I was little seeing statues of Krishna and other gods in the home. I also read Indian folklore and mythology, which I think is what initially sparked my love for all of that. But eventually my mom did convert to Christianity when I was about 4 or 5. And I feel like I grew up in a Christian home. We started going to church right away. And, my story is like many others where people, Sunday school and came to accept faith. But, I think what's interesting is that I grew up around Indians, not just Indian Christians, but Indian Muslims, Indian Hindus, Jainists, and Sikhs. And Indians are very diverse, and Indian Christians are even more diverse than American Christians. And, something that we practice in our community is just the idea of enculturation. It's the idea that in a culturally pluralistic society, with so many diverse people, you have to learn how to get along, whether you agree or not with each other. And I think that cultural background has impacted my theological lens towards many issues, including social justice. And so I'm excited to be here tonight and to hear from a diverse cast of voices and see how we can maybe agree to disagree, but to come together and be united.
Awesome. Thank you. Next, we have Andre Henry. Andre is a writer, a speaker, and a musician with a deep passion for racial justice and social change. He's lectured at universities, worked with community organizers and activists, talked with renowned thought leaders on racial justice, and organized protest actions, all in an effort to be part of a movement for racial justice. So, Andre, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Please tell us a little bit about your faith journey.
Yeah, sure. So, I grew up in the Assemblies of God denomination, and I started following Jesus when I was really young, probably around 7, and felt called to ministry around my teenage years. And one interesting thing, just I think a part of this that weighs into my perspective in this conversation, is that my father was never a believer, and is a Black radical activist, and so we just had lots of great conversations about faith, justice, religion, all that kind of stuff my entire life. And when I started kind of seeing how much of Christianity, or the version of Christianity that I learned, had been influenced by ideologies of whiteness and white power, it was a bit of kind of an apocalypse for me, but at the same time, not too jarring because it's kind of stuff that I would have heard, my father kind of warned me about. And so I think that, like many, 2016 was a watershed moment for me and the faith of my youth, that was already kind of hanging on, was already changing, I should say, was already shifting. But there was like a break around 2016 where I just felt like I had to totally rediscover my faith by moving justice to the center of what I believed about what it meant to be a Christian. I never believed those things to be separate, but I was at least told that it was marginal and was kind of like fighting that battle. And I think just around 2016, I just realized none of this, the gospel stopped being compelling to me and stopped making sense to me until I made that move.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Next, we have Mark Charles. Mark is a man of Navajo and Dutch American descent. He is a speaker, writer, and consultant on the complexities of American history, race, culture, and faith. He's the author of the blog Reflections from the Hogan and was the Washington, D.C. correspondent and columnist for Native News Online. He has served on the boards of the Christian Community Development Association and the Christian Reformed Church of North America. He and his family live in Washington, D.C. He is a presidential candidate for 2020 and is the co-author of the forthcoming Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. Mark, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Yate, JR, thank you so much for having me. Please allow me to introduce myself. So Yate, Mark Charles Yunishia, Sinbake Dana Nishle, the Tohe Glini Bashishin, Sinbake Dana Dasche, the Todachitni Dashinala. In the Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we're a matrilineal people, and so our identity comes from our mother's mother. My mother's mother happens to be American of Dutch heritage, and so I say Tsinbake Dene, and translated that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbake Dene. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Todachitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. My faith journey really began, well, it depends on what side of the family you look at. On my mother's side of the family, they were of the Christian Reformed Church, a Reformed denomination, and Christianity in my mom's side of the family goes back as a long ways. I'm not sure when it started exactly. On my father's side of the family, the faith journey began with my grandparents, who were both boarding school survivors. And my grandmother was in the boarding school and became a Christian. My grandfather became a Christian later in life, but was also a boarding school survivor. And so part of their faith journey was the cultural genocide that took place in the boarding school, of being told you have to become a Christian, but to become a Christian, you first have to become an American. So you have to give up your culture, your faith, everything that is personal and known and sacred to you. You have to give those up and assimilate to Western European culture, and then you can have Christ. So because of that, my grandparents didn't teach the language to my father or the cultural traditions, and so he didn't know it to teach it to me. It wasn't until I was coming out of college and living actually back in New Mexico, and I was preaching in some of our churches around the reservation, and was called to pastor a church in Denver called the Christian Indian Center. And my first council meeting with our congregation, or with our council members, they said to me, our last pastor introduced us to the concept of contextualizing worship for indigenous cultures, and we'd like you to lead us in that. I said, that sounds fantastic. How do you spell it? And they said, well, there's a conference of indigenous Christians meeting in Hawaii, and we want to send you and your wife there for 2 weeks for this conference. So I said to them, well, for nothing other than the sake of the gospel, I will pick up my cross and board that plane to Hawaii with my family and learn about this. But when I got there, it was really a collection of indigenous Christians from all over the world, Christian leaders who their people and their cultures had been colonized by the gospel. And they were on a journey to both decolonize their faith and understand what did it mean to be of their people group, whether it was Navajo or Sami or Maori. What does it mean to be of their people and follow this guy named Jesus? And those relationships and that experience really set me on a journey that I'm still on today. A few years later, we moved back from Denver to the Navajo reservation. We lived in a remote section of our reservation in a single one-room hogan with a dirt floor, log walls, 6 miles off nearest paved road on a dirt road. Our community had no running water, no electricity. And we were living there just as a member of the community. I wasn't leading, I wasn't a missionary, I wasn't a pastor. We were just there living with people. And that experience, we were in that hogan for 3 years, on the reservation for 11 years. We've been in DC now for 4 years. And those 11 years on the reservation of learning how to follow God and yet becoming acutely aware of the injustices that were enacted both historically and presently against people of color, and specifically against Native peoples, and yet being in a place where you're absolutely powerless. You have very little ability to act. You know, unemployment on our reservations is sky high. Social problems abound. We're so ignored and marginalized by most of the nation. And it really is a very powerless place. And so understanding what does it mean to even work towards social change? What does it mean to work towards justice when you do not have resources and power to enact that change? And it really brought me into a deeper understanding of my faith and what I talk about frequently, which is the difference in the dynamic between physical earthly power and spiritual authority. And what does it mean to act not out of power, but out of authority? And so my 11 years there were really a training of how I teach, how I read the scriptures, how I pray, how I interact with structures of power, not by confronting power with power, but by bringing authority into the conversation. And that has transformed my understanding of what does it mean not only to be a Christian and follow Jesus in the most powerful nation in the world, but also what does it mean to work towards social justice and enact change within this structure that is so consumed with a worldly understanding of power.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Next, Karen Gonzalez. Karen is a speaker, writer, and immigrant advocate who works as the Director of Human Resources for World Relief. An immigrant from Guatemala, Gonzalez studied at Fuller Theological Seminary. She has worked in the nonprofit world for more than 10 years and is a former public school teacher. Gonzalez, who lives in Baltimore, has written about spiritual formation, Latinx identity, race, gender, the Enneagram, and immigration. She is the author of The God Who Sees, Immigrants, the Bible, and the Journey to Belong. Her work has been published in Sojourners, Christ and Pop Culture, Faithfully Magazine, Mutuality Magazine, The Mudroom, and The Salt Collective. Karen, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. That's quite an introduction.
Please tell us a little bit about your faith journey.
Sure. So I was born in Guatemala, and I was born into a nominally Catholic family. And my family had me baptized. And when I was about 9 years old, I also did my first communion. And honestly, I felt drawn to God, but did not really understand what I was doing in terms of my first communion. All I felt was kind of confusion, bewilderment. I had a lot of questions, but didn't know where to go, where to ask them. And all of those feelings became emblematic of my life of faith until I was an adult. And it wasn't until we immigrated to the US and I was a college student at the University of South Florida that I encountered InterVarsity, which is a college fellowship that Kathy used to work with until very recently. And I became a Christian, really a serious follower of Jesus. I believe that God was always calling me, but I became a follower of Jesus at that point. And it was a very, I would say, a process sort of salvation journey, because it was just understanding things a little bit at a time. But I guess what always troubled me was I didn't understand what the point was. Was I just supposed to be saved so that I could be a better person and not think bad thoughts and not say careless things. And if that was the point, it seemed to me not that compelling in terms of a life of faith. And so this journey led me. I served overseas for a few years. I came home and I thought, if the gospel doesn't work in the former Soviet Union where I'd been serving, maybe it just doesn't work. And this led me to pursue seminary studies. And in seminary, I really feel like saved my life, which is ironic. A lot of people feel like seminary ruined their faith. But for me, it saved my faith because it allowed me to ask questions, to express doubt and uncertainty, to hold things in tension, and also to just live with questions and love those questions, because some of them, there are no answers. But it was there that I really began to learn about biblical justice, and that the point wasn't just for me to become a slightly better person, but also that God wanted me to be part of making the world right, along with the church.
Awesome. Thank you. Next, we have Pastor Jose Humphreys. The Reverend Jose Humphreys is a facilitator, pastor of Metro Hope Covenant Church, a multi-ethnic church movement in East Harlem, New York City. Humphreys is involved in shalom making in New York City through facilitating conversations, contemplation, and action across social, economic, cultural, and theological boundaries. He is the author of Seeing Jesus in East Harlem. Jose, welcome. Thank you for being here.
It's great to be here.
Please tell us a little bit about your faith journey.
Well, I'm a native New Yorker, Afro-Latino. I grew up in the Latino Assemblies of God church, which was located in Manhattan's Lower East Side. And it was a vibrant, passionate church that really believed in the movement of the Spirit, and also that healing happened on multiple levels. And while there was a lot of passion, there was also a healthy dose of fundamentalism involved in it as well. And realizing that that was part of my early formation. And I think, a real conversation that's reflective of that was a conversation my dad had with me when I was 16. So he says, I think you should be baptized, Jose. And I said, well, I'm not really sure, Dad. He says, well, I don't necessarily think that, I don't know if baptism will lead you to heaven, but you never know. And I just remember, just being left with a foreboding sense of uncertainty. But I think uncertainty in all of the ways that you wouldn't want to feel, right? And it wasn't until later on when I began to, go through, I think, the typical deconstruction of my own theology and my own faith, where, as Karen had mentioned, I think seminary was very formative for creating a space where we could ask questions, and we could look and begin to go back to the some of the debris that we actually left behind, and find that there were parts of it that were very essential to who we are now and who we are becoming. Realizing that there are certain aspects of that faith that were very formative for who I am today, and I'm really grateful. For example, you take the first generation, second generation Latino church, it very much mirrors the exilic experience of the people of Israel when you think about a minority church in the midst of empire. And looking at faith in many ways from the bottom up allowed me to really discover, or uncover, I should say, different forms of theology, develop a more robust language about God, which in many ways transcended the personal pietism that I inherited. So where salvation and gospel was very much about a get out of hell pass, right? Get to heaven. I found through time, space, friendship, community, taking my theology and the gospel that I received and contextualizing it into neighborhoods where we realized like school systems were broken down, people of color are racially profiled, our politics often forget Black and brown folks. Realizing that and recognizing that maybe our gospel does have something to say about that. And I guess getting around the right folks which really allowed me to find something salvific over and over again. And I think that's the beauty of the story that I've inherited over time, that I guess, this idea or this truth, I would say, to be born again is to have just multiple awakenings, have my eyes open continuously to uncover aspects of Jesus that I may have missed somewhere along the way. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Last but certainly not least is Kathy Khang. Kathy is a speaker, journalist, and activist. She has worked in campus ministry for more than 20 years with expertise in issues of gender, ethnicity, justice, and leadership development. She is the author of Raise Your Voice, Why We Stay Silent and How to Speak Up. She is also a columnist for Sojourners Magazine, a writer for Faith and Leadership, and co-author of More Than Serving Tea, Asian American Women on Expectations, Relationships, Leadership, and Faith. Kathy, how's it going?
It's going all right.
Thanks for being here. Tell us a little bit about your faith journey.
So I grew up in the Korean American immigrant church and recall most of the Bible stories and the hymns and sermons in Korean, and didn't know what they meant in English until much later on, and wasn't really rooted in a denomination. It really had a lot to do with location and where there was a concentrated group of Korean immigrants that had formed a church. So I would say growing up, it was very loosely evangelical, even though denominationally it was anything from United Methodist to Wesleyan to Presbyterian. But really, what I grew up with were interns from local Bible colleges doing Sunday school and youth group. So from there, went to college, became a part of a college ministry, worked for a few years, and then joined staff with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And it was then that I began the journey of really trying to figure out what I believed, or what I said I believed, and how that actually applied in my life and aligned with the things that I deeply cared about, and may or may not have come across those sermons or discussions at church. So I have left vocational ministry as of February, and I'm trying to find the next step. And in that, my family and I have also been we are on a bit of a journey trying to find our next church home.
I want to direct this first question for all of you. I hope this kind of turns into more of a freewheeling conversation now that we've done intros. But Karen, if we could start with you, because you mentioned in your story coming to that place where you began to understand biblical justice. So the question is just, what is justice, and how does your faith inform your understanding of justice? But I wonder, especially since you spoke to that already, if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, for me, the sort of figuring out what justice meant started for me in a church service when I was in a very conservative evangelical church, a church where I still have a lot of good friends, and it was a good place for a long time. But one day they were talking about Israel and Palestine, and there had been an event, something that happened where Israel bombed Palestinian village, and the pastor from the front was defending Israel and saying that Israel were God's people. They were part of, the end times plan, and everything that they did was right and good, and we should protect them and always be on their side. And honestly, I didn't know why that was wrong, but it felt so wrong to me. It seemed to me like that God loved justice. God loved making things right in the world. That justice is a relational term of being in right relationship, not just with God, but with one another, with God's creation. It means loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. And this is rooted, I believe, in the character of God. And so for me, hearing that just really left me so unsettled with so many questions. And I just felt like, no, God is always on the side of justice. That's where God lives and is. And so that for me sort of was the beginning of figuring out this question, of what is justice and what is our role as a church in that. Mm-hmm.
Andre, I'm curious here. I know you're an activist. And you mentioned being raised by a father who's an activist. So was there a time that you, like, how did you come to that awareness of what justice was, and like when did your faith intersect that?
Okay, so I would say that for me, these things never existed separately because of the civil rights movement, right? So being a young Black man and hearing that a Baptist preacher organized all of these, church mothers and fathers and students to challenge Jim Crow segregation, I just always thought it was a given. So I kind of lived blissfully in white evangelicalism, thinking we were all on the same page for a long time. I didn't even realize that we weren't. So I just thought that they went together. And so I remember I was actually a pastor in New York City for a while, about 7 years, in West Harlem. I was there. So, and I remember when I would be preaching and I would talk about idolatry and how, when the prophets were, talking about idolatry and Yahweh's anger toward idolatry, it was always attached to how idolatry was also tethered to inhospitality, to injustice, to indifference to the poor and the widow in society. Those things were always together. And so the prophets to me spoke saying that religion without justice lacks integrity. Right? Worship without justice lacks integrity. And so I just thought those were givens. So I was in New York City when Eric Garner was choked to death by a New York City police officer. I was in New York when Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman. I was leaving the East Coast to move to Los Angeles and come to seminary just a few days after Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson. And so I had come my entire life thinking we're more or less on the same page about these things. And the thing that I was preaching about how worship without justice lacks integrity was already a core value of mine. And so to me, it was just common sense. Like, God cares about Eric Garner's death. God cares about Trayvon Martin's death. God cares about Michael Brown's death. So that I think that's why those things were always connected to me, for me.
Mark, I'm curious. You mentioned in your introduction that you've, particularly as a Native man, always felt very removed from a place of justice, at least like as far as the courts and everything are concerned. So for you, like what is it when you say you're striving for justice? What is that, and how does your faith inform that struggle?
That's a very complex question. When I moved back to our reservation and began working among my people, the first question I had to ask myself is, what's my gospel? What's the good news I'm bringing to the people here, to my people? Is the good news that God can give you a better education and give you a better job and increase your income level? Or is my gospel the fact that God can meet you where you're at and give you purpose in your life and set you free from the trappings of this world? And the challenge we face is there's a big disconnect that the Western church has from Old Testament versus New Testament theology. In the Old Testament, the people of Israel have a land covenant with the God of Abraham. And this land covenant sets up prosperity as a barometer of their relationship with God. When they're obedient, they're blessed on their land and they prosper. when they're disobedient to God, they're exiled from their land and they suffer. So the people of Israel in the Old Testament can generally have a barometer of their relationship with God when they look at their prosperity. Are they prospering? Okay, they're probably doing well with God. Are they not prospering? Well, they may have some problems. Now, it's not a perfect judge, but it's a barometer. It's one of the ways they can tell. So when Jesus comes into the world, the people of Israel are under oppression, and they're looking for an imperial political Messiah to come and set them free. And Jesus knows what he came to do, and he did not come as a political or imperial Messiah. He came for some very different purposes. And so when Satan tempts him and says, if you bow down to me, I'll give you the kingdoms of the world, Jesus says, no, that's not what I want. When Jesus feeds the 4,000 and they come and try to make him king by force, he says, no, that's not why I'm here. When he's out one day and he's healing people and casting out demons, and he actually heals the servant of a centurion who is the enemy. He's part of the oppression. And John the Baptist, who has been heralding Jesus' coming, he's in prison being guarded by Roman soldiers, and he hears that Jesus is healing the servants of centurions. And he's so confused by this that he sends his disciples to Jesus and says, are you the one who's coming, or should we wait for somebody else? Because you're not the Messiah I was expecting. And Jesus heals more people, casts out more demons, gives sight to more of the blind, hearing to more of the deaf, and says, well, go back and tell your master what you saw, and blessed is a person who doesn't stumble on my account. Tell John to either get on board or get out of the way. And so Jesus is very adamant that he's not this imperial Messiah people are looking for. And then in Mark 8, he asks his disciples, who do men say I am? Well, some think you're Elijah, some think you're John the Baptist, some think you're one of the Old Testament prophets. He says, well, who do you think I am? And Peter correctly identifies him and says, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah. And then Jesus teaches them that the Messiah must suffer and die. The Messiah must be persecuted. The Messiah is going to be mistreated and even killed. And this is so confounding to Peter. This is so anti what he expected the Messiah to be. He takes his own teacher aside and rebukes him. In the Beatitudes, back in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus actually says to his disciples, when you are persecuted on account of my name, you should rejoice, because this is how the prophets of Old Testament were treated. So Jesus is giving his disciples a new barometer of their relationship with God. They will know they are doing well in their discipleship, not when they prosper, but when they are persecuted. Now, the disciples reject this. They hate this barometer. They want nothing to do with it. And it's not until Pentecost they finally begin to get it. And most of the disciples then go on to die a martyr's death because they are so convinced of this role and this barometer set out by their Messiah and their friend Jesus. And so I could go through my whole book, I'm not going to do this right now, but this changes when you get to Eusebius and Constantine. And Eusebius, when the great persecution touches him, and before he's identified the martyrs of the church as heroes of the faith, and now he's propping up the emperors as God's ordained rulers of Rome because he wants to end the persecution because it's touched him physically. And he sets up Constantine as God's ordained ruler, compares him to Moses, feeds him this heresy of Christian empire, and Constantine bites and creates Christendom. He's embracing this old barometer, not of persecution, but of prosperity. And so because the church has been embedded with empire for 2,000 years, the church has rejected persecution and embraced prosperity as its barometer of its relationship with God. The church actually doesn't have an integrity issue. It doesn't have integrity when it fights for justice, because the church is not supposed to be fighting for justice as the privileged. The church is supposed to be fighting for justice from the margins. And so because of this heresy the church has accepted for 2,000 years, it's not that God doesn't care about justice, but the church is fighting from the wrong end of the battle. The church is fighting as the wealthy, as the rich, as the prosperous, as the landowners, as the slaveholders, as all of these other things. And it's not fighting from the margins where Jesus went. His life wasn't circumstantial. He chose to live on the margins. He chose to hang out with the tax collectors and the sinners and the prostitutes and the poor. He chose to be in that space. And he was fighting for things. He was working towards justice from that space. But the church today fights for justice as one of the powerful and the privileged, which is not the place where the church is supposed to be. And so because of this, the fight for justice and even the pushback against justice is so challenging because the church has forgotten what side of the equation it's supposed to be on.
Mm. Wow. Michelle, you mentioned growing up in a very pluralistic area where there were people of not just a couple of faiths, but several different faiths. So when you talk about justice, like how does that pluralistic background inform that? Is justice, maybe one of the things I'm going to say is justice something that we can work towards as a common good? And if so, like, again, what is the uniquely Christian contribution in that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny in a sense because I think growing up Indian and Indian Christian, I think sometimes there's this unsaid mantra that like we're supposed to grow up as entrepreneurs and financially support these sort of causes, but we're not supposed to like get involved ourselves. I think that's very Indian. But I think that in me and my husband being church planters in a very urban, multicultural and disadvantaged community, that's changed a lot of my own cultural understanding of what social justice and activism even is. I mean, we live in that part of town where our first house was next to like the most famous drug house. We deal with people trying to get out of the drug cartel business. Our neighbors are people suffering from mass incarceration. We have ICE raids happening across from our playgrounds. We have single mothers in our church with 8 kids who've gotten their apartments like theft and everything robbed, and they don't have money for next month's rent, and they're on the verge of being homeless. And that changes things. That changes your perspective. It has to. Being proximate to the pain and suffering of this world, changes you, and I think for the good. But I also wanted to just add in there that I recognize that the term social justice is so loaded and confusing. And I think perhaps even a lot of people coming and joining our conversation tonight have different definitions of it. And I just wanted to make a comment about that, because I recognize that there are a lot of voices out there saying the social justice is not the gospel, or the social justice threatens the gospel. And what are we supposed to do with that then? As Christians, feeling like, okay, I see all these pains and suffering in the world. Is this part of my faith to care for these people? And if so, how to do it and how to do it well? From my own experience and from my own reading of scripture, I believe that the idea of justice is synonymous with the gospel. Both seek the restoration of all things. And if I could trace a very brief chronology, if you look in the Old Testament, there are 2 terms used almost synonymously. There's mishpat, meaning justice, and tzedakah as righteousness. And we see, particularly in Hebrew poetry, that these are used in as parallelism with each other. And God himself uses these terms in parallel with each other. So if you go to Job 29, for example, God says, I put on righteousness as my clothing, justice is my robe and my turban. And so you have all the way back in the Old Testament, God himself, in the same way that we're like, hi, my name is Michelle, I'm a church planter. Like, God is introducing himself as the defender, the first and foremost defender of the people who have been oppressed and are hurting. And so I think that's very interesting, that God is our forerunner, and we shouldn't forget that. And then much of the Mosaic law is dealing with interpersonal justice, right? It's if somebody has committed this against you, here's how to rectify the situation. Karen mentioned that about how social justice is interpersonal justice, and it's about restoration. And I think if you move to the New Testament with the kingdom of God and Jesus coming to earth, his ministry is holistically restorative, right? I mean, yes, he's coming to restore us spiritually and to treat our sin and atone for it, but he also heals people physically and restores them to society. And I think that's very important, that he comes to make us whole in every aspect of the term. Revelation 21:5, he says, "See, I am making all things new." So perhaps when it comes to the issue of social justice, maybe we need a new term. I think sometimes social justice is so embedded in ideologies of political affiliations or political bandwagons. Even the term biblical justice has now been associated with certain voices. Maybe we could use the idea of gospel-rooted justice or restorative justice or interpersonal justice. But at least for me, when I think of social justice, I'm thinking of it as this restoration of people and making them whole, and that you do on a variety of levels, right? I mean, on the one hand, this is just how to have simple, fair, and honest dealings with people in everyday life, treating people as the Imago Dei. I think it also means radical, generous giving of our time and resources. And then it is also activism against injustice and violence. It's consoling the person and being part of the resistance. It's all of the above. But I don't know if that's a helpful
comment. That's great. Thank you. That was awesome.
Social justice and the idea of restoration.
Yeah, thank you. Jose, I'm curious, as a church planter, as someone who's a native New Yorker, been in an urban environment all of your life, how has that shaped your understanding of justice, and where's your faith interplay with that?
Greatly. I'm in full agreement with Michelle. Theology and how we construct it, and even ecclesiology, how we do church, how we be church, is very much rooted in the language that we use. So a lot of our formation is rooted in our language. So in the past, recognizing the people that come into my church, much of their formation, if they are somehow church, was rooted in sometimes hyper individualized, overly pietistic gospel. I had to really kind of flip the script. And so I'm preaching the gospel every Sunday. I'm not preaching just, a gospel that somehow has some public dimension to it. Public dimension is inherently a part of the gospel. And if you look at the word itself, evangelion, gospel in the Greek, it kind of creates this image of a heralding of good news, a declaration and a proclamation of this new kingdom that's first coming in. And I know that you'll appreciate this, JR, if you remember Thanos, right, in Avengers Infinity Wars. There you go. I have to throw that in. He sent heralds, right, to Earth and to bring his good news about annihilations, good news, quote unquote. So when we think about the gospel and the good news and the heralding of something, of this message, it inherently not only looks after a person's personal wellness, but it's also good news for the ecology as well, which is rooted in the Jewish language and the Jewish concept of shalom, that in the beginning God created, and all things were good, very good, tov meod in the Hebrew. So things were in harmony. Relationship was good. Relationship with God was great. Relationship between people and the environment was something that was wondrous under shalom. And somehow that unraveled. So when I preach the gospel on Sundays, I'm consistently referring to both our personal formation, but how this personal formation is of public consequence. In other words, what happens after we break, after our benediction, right? So we have our holy huddle on Sundays. We send forth people. What's happening after that? And I think that's when the gospel really begins to take hold, and what people think about doing and how they think about living it at work, at home, how they decide to be good neighbors, how they decide to make economic decisions, where they shop? Do they buy local versus do they go to the franchise model? Whatever it is, we realize that the gospel has jurisdiction over both personal and public dimensions. And I'll just say this one more thing, that it's interesting that in Jesus's own launch of his public platform, in many ways, it sounded very political. He opens up the scroll, right? Isaiah 61 and Luke chapter 4. And if you look at what the scripture text that he references, none of it really refers to this idea of personal salvation. Although, you know, I, as a good evangelical and a Pentecostal still, in many ways, I do believe in personal salvation. But when you look at Jesus's, I guess, own coming out party, in a sense, he says, I've been called, I've been filled by the Spirit of God to preach the good news, first and foremost to the poor, to liberate the oppressed, to set the captive free, and to declare the year of God's Jubilee. In other words, all of these things that he is referring to has to do with both the social and interpersonal dimension. There was no need to use social as a qualifier because social was actually integrated into the very quality and the nature of the gospel itself.
Mm.
And that's what I preach on Sunday. There's no dichotomy. There are no false separations. You know, maybe as we mentioned earlier, social justice, maybe the term itself is not helpful because in many ways it's been co-opted.
Thank you. Kathy, so I know because I creeped and read your book that you are not by nature someone who is going to speak up. And yet you wrote a whole book about being compelled to do that, compelled to justice, specifically by your faith. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you know, it's a little bit around what Jose was talking about, this idea of a personal salvation. Yes, having grown up evangelical, that's absolutely a thing. But growing up in a communal culture, Korean immigrants, there's no me. There's no I'm doing this. It is always in community. Decisions that I may make are always assumed to have some sort of implication on my community. And so I think as I've gotten older and as I continue to wrestle with my faith and what I thought I understood the gospel to be, I realized that it could not be just about whether or not I got to heaven. Right. And I feel like that was so much of my youth group experience. And even in my young adulthood, like, if you died today, do you know where you would be? That kind of thing. And so understanding that, yes, the term social justice is not found, but that's also because we don't live in a culture that mirrors and mimics what the culture of biblical text was about. And so in that, I found that when there were things that impacted me, they impacted my community, right? When I experienced racism, that was not a one-off individual experience. That has repercussions in my community and how I grow up and how I see people and how I engage with others. That goes beyond whether or not I think I'm going to get to heaven. And so I realized I can't, you can't not say things. I mean, I suppose you can. There are plenty of people who don't, but I just found that because my love for Jesus and my love for my community intersects, right? Jesus loves not just me. Jesus didn't just die for me. Jesus died for the world. And there's a world I do not know, but my actions impact the world. So out of that, I realized, I couldn't just be able to spout off some Bible verses. I actually needed to be able to articulate what I believed and why that made a difference in community, not just in an individual life, but in community. And so, yeah, then the book eventually came out. But again, even that, I would say the things that we all care about, yes, we can put them under that label of social justice, but that's not what compels us. It's the gospel that compels us. We just happen to find terms that fit currently.
Okay, so I want to ask a question, and Andre, I want to start with you, just because you just like a couple of days ago posted on your blog about the need to really take care of yourself, specifically because doing the work of justice is so exhausting. And so I want to start with you and Kathy, because I think you're my two go-to self-care experts. But I would love to hear from all of you about because again, I think particularly when you get engaged. Even if all the engagement you're doing is beginning the process of educating yourself, it quickly becomes very brutal. And then I think especially when you take that next step to getting active and starting to implement some of the things that you're learning into making a difference in the world, it's easy to get beat down, exhausted, hopeless. And I don't remember if it was in the pre-call or when we first started, but someone said, you got to have hope to do this stuff. So, Andre, could you talk a little bit about kind of what brought you to write that, and then just a couple of ideas about where you are about, again, how to make sure that we're running a marathon here and not a sprint?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, the other day I wrote, or the last blog post that I wrote was saying that we don't just want to fight for our lives. We want to actually live. We want to enjoy ourselves. And that comes from a deep place of believing that even when we're talking about justice work or social justice activism, that there's an aiming through the target that we're doing, right? It's the fight is not an end in itself, but it's a means to get to somewhere. And I think that is rooted in the idea that God has made us for delight, for enjoyment, for pleasure. You know, the word Eden, the Garden of Eden, is the Hebrew word for pleasure, bliss. You know, it comes from the whole ancient Near Eastern concept that when the gods made the world, they would make a garden for themselves that they would enjoy, their own garden of bliss. There's a whole this appears a lot in ancient Near Eastern literature. And so, you know, when I think of what justice is for, what justice work is for, or what justice looks like when it is our common sense, when it is our only way of life, that it's something like what God always intended in the beginning and something that God intends to restore. And so I think that that's, first off, one thing to keep in mind, right? But to do the work, you're constantly looking at what is wrong, right? And you're constantly talking about what is wrong, and thinking about what is wrong, and trying to keep yourself up to date about what is wrong and what you could do to make it right. And like you said, you know, that can make it very exhausting. And I think that as far as racism is concerned, I started finding that the more that I read is the less that I realized that I knew, right? Like I realized that the problem is always worse and bigger and more pervasive and more ubiquitous and more deeply entrenched than I thought than before. There's always a new level to it. And I've literally had moments where I've just felt like just kind of crushed under the weight of the reality of the situation. And I realized I can't live like that. You know, that will kill me, you know? And I mentioned in the article that you referenced that Dr. King, although he was assassinated when he was 39, the coroner report said that his heart looked like it had aged to that of a 60-year-old, you know? And I think that a lot of that has to do with the stress that he was under. And there are several ways in which I've decided that I will not be like Dr. King, and that is one of them, is that I will not die of a big heart. I believe that we should grieve, we should lament, we should do those things publicly, but we also we need to engage in that part of the life of God that God created us for, which is to enjoy the garden that He created, right? And it's an injustice for us not to. Like that is not fair, that people of color would live their entire lives expending most of their energy fighting white supremacy. It's not fair that we should do that. And so
I think you said fixing problems we didn't break.
exactly,
Right?
cleaning up a mess that we did not
Oh,
make,
yeah.
you know? And so we have to fight out of an existential necessity. But it is also our birthright as children of God to experience delight and play. And I just really believe that. So sorry, I've gone like on a soapbox about like that whole, the root of what, the root of taking care of myself, but that's where it comes from. And so I am not naturally a hopeful person. And for a long time, I didn't feel like I could be a hopeful person, because we live in a society that mistakes delusion for hope and sentimentality for wisdom. And there's this kind of toxic positivity that people have where it's just like, ignore the facts, stick your head under the ground and pretend that everything is okay. And that just wasn't enough for me. But someone sent me a book because I had spent like a couple years lamenting in public and carrying a boulder, the largest boulder I could find around Los Angeles, to show people like, this is what it feels like, this is what this burden looks like. And someone sent me a book because they knew that I was going to die if I kept doing that. And it was called Hope in the Dark. And it's by Rebecca Solnit. And that began to change my mind about what hope is. And I began to change my idea about hope not being this saying that things will be okay just because you feel like that's the right thing, that's what you're supposed to say, or that's what you're pressured to believe, or because you don't want to be a negative Nancy or a wet sandwich, as I like to say. But that hope is a humility about the future. That hope is, you don't know what is going to happen tomorrow. And because you don't know what's going to happen, there's space for you to act, right? Optimists say, or pessimists are sure that no matter what you do, tomorrow's going to suck. But optimists are also like, no matter what you do, everything's going to be fine. And both excuse themselves from action, is what I read in the book. But hope looks at the future and says, maybe, right? Maybe things could turn out well, and we have the power to influence the outcome. And that changed my look. And so I started engaging in hope as a discipline, as a habit, as something that it's not an emotion that comes upon me here and there. It's something that I invest in through reading the stories of ordinary people who have worked together to change the world. That my hope is based in memory. It's based in fact. It's based in understanding the mechanics of how social movements and social change works together. And I invest in that. I have several books. One is called The Impossible Will Take a Little While. The other one is Hope in the Dark that I mentioned. And I read those like a devotional. I read a story about some people who ran some dictator out of their country, or chased off colonizers, or won a revolution, every single day, just to remind myself that it's possible, and that it's the Lord's work. I know I've gone on and on and on. I just want to say one more thing about that.
Please.
I want to say one more thing about that, is that because I know that I tend to say things and not necessarily always ground them in how they come from my faith. And one passage came back to me during this time as I was learning about hope, and it was the 3 Hebrew boys that were thrown into that furnace. Because here are these 3 people living under an empire who are being forced to worship a false god. And the thing they say to Nebuchadnezzar is, the Lord will deliver us, but even if he doesn't. And I always think about how they threw that in there, that there was this possibility that they may not be saved. And so I always tell people that maybe is the language of hope. And I feel like that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said that day. They said, either way, we don't really know what the future holds. It may turn out that we'll be burnt to a crisp. It may be that we'll die and be resurrected. It may be that God will save us miraculously. And I think that that is what hope does. It's a humility about the future. It's an openness to possibilities. It's an openness in our imagination to see alternatives where things seem to be certain. And like I said, I invest in that through reading, and I invest in that through taking breaks and knowing that, like you said, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. But I heard someone one day say it's not a marathon, it's a relay. And that takes so much pressure off of me to realize that the work does not depend on me. I have a part to play. I have to do my part. But if I need to take a break, then it's all going to be fine. It's going to keep doing what it's doing. And that it is my birthright to also enjoy my life. God enjoys his life. God created us to partake in the divine nature, which means that God wants for us to enjoy our lives too.
Yes.
Sorry, I just like went on a rampage. I'm
so good.
What about some of the rest of you? I mean, I am sure Andre's not the only one who feels this sort of tension, this sort of temptation towards exhaustion. How do you make sure that you're in it for the long haul?
I wanted to share just a quick story that relates to this. And for my husband and I in our ministry, I think celebrating the small wins is really important because they don't always come that often. And I have a friend who's a part of our church, and her story is like many of the people in our church, and that's that she was brought here as a child, and her parents basically just brought her to Florida and then abandoned her, and she was forced to fend for herself, grow up on the streets. She met a guy, got pregnant, and then moved to Austin, Texas, and started life here. Had 2 more kids before the guy abandoned her, and now she's a single mom with 3 kids here in Austin, but with no documentation and no access to the benefits of our country. No driver's license, no work permit, no medical insurance. And that's when I met her, and her kids are literally starving because she doesn't have any food to feed them. And I mean, these are the kinds of stories and the people that are our friends and our neighbors and our church attendees. And it's hard. It's hard. I mean, we sit down with these people either in their homes or in ours, and I mean, we're just weeping with them, just crying with them as they're sharing their story. Women who have escaped from human trafficking and have just sort of accidentally crossed the border and found themselves in America, and they're like, what do? I don't know where my family is. I don't know, where home is. And for us, caring for the individual is always our first, immediate response. How do we care for them physically, emotionally, spiritually, like make sure they have a roof over their head, that they have food for themselves and their kids. And then the next day, start working on the systemic issues that are causing these injustices. And it's this one gal that I mentioned, it's been a long road with her, but we've finally been able to get the application approved for her to be a DACA recipient. So now she can have a work permit. And just something as little as that was like, we need to celebrate, and we had her over, we had a big dinner. It was like feasting, because all of these struggles and all of these pains and abandonment and her, being in this country that she didn't want to be brought to, and then being left here and have to fend for herself, and to now feel like she's getting closer to being a member of this society, from being at the margins to coming towards the center and feeling like life is a little bit more stable. It was a big moment. It was something to celebrate. And since then, she's got her driver's license, and a member of our church had an extra car that they then gave to her, actually put in her name to have. And that was like another celebration. It was like, yes. And for us, a lot of these small wins we celebrate with food. We feast hard. We eat hard. I think maybe that's the Indian, and my husband's Latino. I think that's just, the minority in us. We just when we celebrate, we eat, and you know, just taste and savor all the goodness of God in these things. And so, yeah, that's a big one for us.
Yeah, can I say something? Similarly, I think it's really important to celebrate small, however small they are. You know, they're big relationally, right? These things may seem small, but they're really big to that mother and her children, right? It made a huge difference. I was really thinking about so many people in the Bible that God made promises to, you know, and I think often about Mary and Joseph, who were, you know, told these great things, right? And, you know, Joseph, even as a man, was called to get behind his wife's calling. And they had to trust that God was at work in things they did not see or understand. And this is what it means to live a life of faith. And recently I was reminded of this. I was feeling really discouraged. And a couple of weekends ago, I went on a trip to the border. We crossed from San Diego into Tijuana and visited migrant shelters and churches. And it was such a supremely encouraging trip because what I didn't see, what I didn't know or understand was how much the Mexican church is stepping up. And it was so heartening and so encouraging to see the good work, to see the way that the economy in Tijuana has opportunities for migrants who want to stay. I went to a shelter that was just all people who've been deported. And you would think it would be like a very sad and depressing place. But no, there was like flourishing and thriving there. There was art therapy. There was job counseling. There was so much good. There was fresh food. There was a man carefully cutting these limes with precision because it was for their soup, you know, for that day. And all of those things really gave me so much hope. Not to say that the situation is solved or that there isn't violent rhetoric toward immigrants and that many are not suffering, but that there's so much that we don't know and don't see. And as people of faith, that's our call, right? I love what Andre said about this being a relay. Like we have our part to play, and it's not for us to do everything, but it is to do something. And perhaps if we're doing everything, it might be that we're doing more than we're supposed to. And we're feeling this pressure to be like God instead of to play our part and serve God the way Joseph did, raising a child, probably dying before that child was an adult, and never getting to see the fruit of that call of God saying, I want you to raise the Savior of the world. And so that's what gives me the hope, you know, that's what gives me the little maybe that Andre was talking about.
Oh, I love that. All right, I want to get to some listener questions because we've actually gotten a ton of them. And so I'm going to kind of throw these out rapid fire. And any of you who want to speak to them, please just jump right in. So the first one is from Carrie McIntosh. And she asks, and maybe this would be specifically for those of you who are in church leadership, what does justice as the center of our worship look like in a practical sense?
I guess I'll jump in there. It's a great question. One of the things that I realize is just doing work here in East Harlem in an urban center is that it's important for our liturgy to reflect our social reality. And oftentimes, whether it's like overly sentimental songs that we sing that are just about us and Jesus, right? And or just maybe reading scripture texts that really speak to the character of God, yet somehow doesn't make its way to showing the whole reflection of God as it navigates through society, through God's spirit, through God's church, and through God's community. So I think it's really important to incorporate prayers of the people that are reflective of just our neighborhood and the injustices as well. So whether though the liturgy reflects a lament about police violence, for example. I remember when the whole Eric Garner, Michael Brown thing went down a couple of years ago. It was important for our church to include it in the liturgy, to name it. And I know a lot of pastors who were very just kind of befuddled about the whole thing, and were feeling like they didn't want to take that risk for fear of some backlash. And I felt compelled to have to include a word about, not only systemic injustice, the cries of the people, the black and brown blood that has literally spilled on the streets. And it in many ways, as a pastor, was my duty to raise that voice within the ecclesia, within the church context. And to do otherwise would be a Micah kind of 6 moment, where I think where God was admonishing the people of Israel for worshiping, yet forgetting about the orphan and the widow, for committing grave injustices. And they were, basically, God says, your religious services are in essence an abomination or a noise, right? So I think if there's ways to really just incorporate what's happening in the world, whether it's through the acknowledgement of a prayer, a litany, a call and response, a testimony from someone in the neighborhood who got a job, who was able to overcome some sort of injustice, I think those are ways to center justice, which is ultimately to center God.
And if I can just add to that, I think it's also, I agree to everything Jose is saying. So yes, amen. If I could add to that, it's also, I think, important for the church to learn that we don't always have to be the leaders in this, that we also need to follow and be learners and have humility. I think sometimes we as the church and as Christians, we feel like we have to know it all and we have to be leading the way. And if we're not, whatever anyone else is doing is just wrong, that we're right and everyone else is wrong. There's a very interesting quote by Martin Luther King, actually, about Gandhi in his Christian Century. And he says this: "I believe that in some marvelous way, God worked through Gandhi and the spirit of Jesus Christ saturated his life. It's ironic yet inescapably true that the greatest Christian of the modern world was a man who never embraced Christianity." And I think oftentimes Christians are so scared to listen to secular voices. We just stiff arm our critics as opposed to perhaps seeing them as teachers. And I found the statement made by Pastor Tracy Blackman after Ferguson so provocative, about the idea of bringing the church to the streets. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to, as a church, recognize our limitations, get out of our bubble. And I think this is freeing because pastors and Christian leaders alike don't have to have the burden of knowing and doing it all. Like there's supposed to be partnership, leading and following.
I know after some of the traumatic events in our nations, I've often in our worship gatherings just taken some time in the middle of the gathering to do just a prayer that specifically addresses that. And oftentimes my prayers end up being, Jesus, we have no idea what to do. We're just heartbroken. Please be with us and give us your grace. And just that level of like vulnerability and honesty on my part actually seems to has connected with our people a lot, because they've pulled me aside and said, I didn't know what to do when I came in today, and I didn't know how to pray. And I was like, well, I was maybe half a step ahead of you. I didn't really know much either, but like we could just all not know much together and be honest with God about that. And that has been meaningful, I think, even if again, if you're where I am, where you don't know a whole lot. I want to flip the question around. This is from JD Reynolds, and Mark, he actually was queuing off something you said early, where you talked about having to operate from a place without a lot of power. He said, how do we lead our churches into social justice ministry when we aren't in pastoral or other staff positions? So do you have any advice for folks who are in a church where maybe justice work is not really central? This is something that they feel really compelled to. Are there positive ways to be an influence when you're not in those leadership positions?
Absolutely. I mean, I think again, when you look at the role of Christ, is he lived on the margins. And when you live on the margins, you intentionally choose to make that your home. You're going to see these injustices and you're going to be involved in them. You know, if you are living in the inner city and you're sending your kids to the public school, you're going to be praying for the public schools a lot more than if you live in the suburbs and send your kids to the private school and you just know there's a problem in the public schools. So if the church is able to kind of give up its barometer of prosperity and understand we're actually called to the margins, then you don't even have to be a pastor in your church. If you go to a church that may not have a value for that yet, but you live in the margins, and therefore you bring that's your part of the community. You know, you're in this community that's in the margins, and you're just living there, not to save the margins, but because this is your home, these are your neighbors, this is the place that you live. Then you're going to be bringing those concerns into the church, and that is going to hopefully have influence on the church, and actually draw the church into those marginal places. You know, so when we lived on the reservation, when we first moved back there, because I grew up in a border town to the reservation, because I had already pastored a church, because I had my degree from a good university, I knew there would be a temptation of people from my community to see me or put me in a place of leadership almost immediately. And so when we moved back there, I said to myself, I actually created a rule where I said, I'm not going to lead. I'm not going to accept a position of leadership. I'm not going to step into a role of leadership. I am merely here to live and do life with my people for 3 years out in the Hogan, for another 8 years in Fort Defiance. And that kind of intentional choice to say I'm not going to step into those places of leadership actually helped me to see and understand the deep systemic problems we have within the margins. And then it was while I was living there, and we were on the reservation, we've been there for 4 or 5 years, I'm seeing the deep systemic problems, and my heart is breaking. And I'm praying one day, and I said, God, you know, even when Jesus was here on earth, he fed the people he was preaching to. Like, I know you brought me here to understand how to bring the gospel to my people, but even Jesus fed the people who were hungry right in front of him. How do you want me to feed my people? And God, I can't go into the way God answered that prayer, but basically God gave me a massively systemic issue and said, work on this issue. And I'm like, wouldn't a soup kitchen be easier? You know, like, you're talking about deep systemic issues, and God's like, yeah, this is what I want you to work on. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't even know how to begin to wrap my head around that. But it led me to this place of, when you live on the margins, and you bring the problems of the margins to the God of the universe, his response rarely is a soup kitchen. His response is like, let's deal with the root of the problems, and let's deal with what's actually going down here. You know, as much as I'll use the immigration debate as an example, you know, where we have the conservative side of our country, the Republicans, who are screaming about building a wall to keep people out. And we have the liberal side and the progressive side, the Democrats, saying, no, we have to let people in. We have to care for those who are without. And one day I'm out, this is 12 years ago, actually 2004, 2005, I'm herding sheep with one of the members of our community out on the reservation. We're walking through the fields one day, and I said to this man who's a boarding school survivor, he speaks better Navajo than English. I said, you know, the whole nation's talking about immigration reform. I'm curious what your thoughts are. And he said, well, there's already so many of them here. Maybe we shouldn't worry about borders anymore. Now, if you're anywhere else in the country, you immediately think he's talking about the 14 million who have come over the southern border, undocumented people. But because we're both Native, because he's a boarding school survivor, because we're on the reservation, you have to pause and ask, is he referring to the 14 million or the 300 million? Mm-hmm. And I love the ambiguity so much, I didn't even ask him to clarify. And from that point on and up until today, I'm telling people, I don't care if you're building a wall to keep people out or if you're trying to tear down a wall to let people in. If you do not have indigenous Native peoples at the table helping you construct your immigration reform, whatever you come up with will neither be just nor will it be comprehensive. Without Natives at the table, the United States of America is incapable of justly and comprehensively reforming immigration law. Without Natives at the table, all you have is one generation of undocumented immigrants trying to figure out what to do with another generation of undocumented immigrants, and there's no integrity in the dialogue. And that's the dialogue the church has to bring to the table. That's where you're really talking from the margin and saying we have to deal with the root of the problem, which is all these undocumented, and yes, I call our nation undocumented immigrants because if you don't know what treaty gives you a right to own the land that you're living on, you are not documented. If you don't know what treaty gives you the right to live in the city, in the state, in the lot that you're living on, you are undocumented. And we as a nation don't know how to deal with this. And because the church doesn't live on the margins, it just picks one side or the other side of this political battle and screams at each other. And it doesn't actually get to the heart of the problem, which is we are a colonial nation that enacted genocide and used the doctrine of discovery and then the narrative of American exceptionalism and the mythology of promised lands to ethnically cleanse the people who were living here.
We could do another entire couple hours on all that you had said, Mark. I come from a place where I am the suburban soccer mom, although none of my kids play soccer, so I drive a minivan. And when I get a little worried, to be honest, when white Christian siblings talk about wanting to move into the margins and what that can mean. And Mark, I think early on in the conversation, you had talked about scripture, and when we find ourselves persecuted, we're in the right place, and how that also can get so twisted because we currently in evangelical circles, there are plenty of Christians who feel like they are persecuted here in the US. And that's the language that exists. But I was, all of these great things I'm thinking about, and I wanted to go back to the question around a practical, what can our church do? And one of the things I like to tell churches is don't start running to the border and wanting to do missions work, right? Don't go moving into the inner city. Don't become the gentrifiers. Don't all of that. I mean, sometimes you've got to look at what you do on a weekly basis in your church, right? Things that may not feel big, but are those small, important wins that are very much tied to systemic issues around being in a place of privilege. So one example from a church that we no longer attend, but loved this shift and the question around it, or the questions. The church used, and still does, I believe, gather for a meal on Wednesday nights. And you pay what you can. There's a donation jar. Money is set aside for that. And you don't have to be a part of the church to come to Wednesday night dinner. I would invite my kids' friends who were over for play dates, like, we have to go to church for dinner. Do you want to come? You can stick around for youth group if you want, or we can go home, but I'm not cooking dinner. And there was a lot of conversation around the number of paper plates, plastic forks, and plastic cups that were being used. Right. We're not going to solve the world's problems. But there was this big discussion around why. That's such a little thing. And then we stopped to think about the amount of waste we were producing in this time that was supposed to be for fellowship. And why didn't we want to wash dishes? Right? Why didn't we want to waste time washing dishes? And I think that shift was awesome. It moved, they started using plates and forks and cups, and you would take shifts and spend time with different people washing dishes, catching up on the church gossip, but realizing the damage we were doing to the neighborhood and the community by just the sheer amount of waste that we were producing in this thing that was supposed to be honoring and beautiful. And what it did was it just filled up the trash, right, in one area. And to be able to shift that was one of those things that I think churches really need to take a look at, is how do you do your fellowship? And how do we hurt the world?
I love that. All right. Well, we are shockingly already out of time. I can't believe we didn't even get to less than half of our questions. But here's what I'd like to do. So we are all on Twitter, which is a great place for further conversations. We not only didn't get to even half of the questions I wrote, we got to less than half of the questions y'all submitted by a large margin. So we would like to continue this conversation after this event is over. So I'm going to ask each of you to share your Twitter handle. And then if I could also ask you to share like one resource that you just absolutely love, either that you're currently enjoying that's spurring you to a public faith, or one of your like all-time on the top of the bookshelf, everyone should be required to read this kind of whatever you want to do. So Michelle, how about if you go first? Tell us where you're on Twitter and then give us a resource.
Yeah, cool. On Twitter, my handle is Dr_Reyes2. And I'm sorry, JR, I'm not going to follow the rules. Can I give 2 resources?
Sure, it's fine.
Okay,
Total anarchy.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. Jamar Tisby's The Color of Compromise. I think that's a super helpful book in just understanding what the church has been complicit in, and sort of our areas of ignorance, and how that's an important element in changing our perspective on social justice and systemic injustice, if you will. And the second book, which is here on my desk, is Timothy Keller's Generous Justice. I think that's also very useful book in terms of working definitions and theological framework.
Awesome. Thank you. Andre, please.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter as Andre Henry. And gosh, one resource. There is a book that I really love, and I think anyone who wants to see some kind of social change in the world should definitely read it. It is called Blueprint for a Revolution. It's by a guy named Srdja Popovic. You spell Srdja S-R-D-J-A. Yeah, S-R-D-J-A. And it just is funny and really practical and really down to earth, and can help demystify like how you might go about bringing some people together and making a difference.
Awesome. Thank you. Jose?
Twitter handle at Jose Humphreys. And I guess the number one resource right now that comes to mind, since we are talking about the gospel, is Lisa Sharon Harper's book, The Very Good Gospel. And I think in many ways it dismantles all of our false divisions between social and personal and public and private. So she does a really good job of just breaking that down and starting through the original concept of Hebrew and Shalom.
Thank you very much. Karen?
So I'm on Twitter at _ Karen J. Gonzalez. And as far as resources, so one of the books that I just started reading that has really spoken to me is Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. And I had never read it, believe it or not. I'm a bad seminary student, but it is a deeply transforming book in all the best ways.
Awesome. Thank you. Kathy.
I am on Twitter as at Ms. Kathy Khang. And I was hoping she would, self-promote her own book, but I'm going to promote her book. I'm going to promote Karen's book, The God Who Sees. It's just an amazing resource around immigration, but helping us understand what we are talking about when we say God is the God who sees, and God is the one who is with those on the margins in a very practical, honest way. So that's my resource.
Thank you. And Mark.
Thank you. So my Twitter handle and my Instagram and all my social media handles are Wireless Hogan, WIRELESSHOGAN. And the resource I'd like to recommend is Sung-Chan Ra and I have this book coming out. It's due to be out November 5th. It's called Unsettling Truths, The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. It's literally 8 years of research and 3 years of writing. And it's a resource I am absolutely thrilled to have available coming out this next year. So
awesome. Is it up for pre-order yet? I saw it's getting
for pre-order on InterVarsity's website, InterVarsity Press, and you can view it on Amazon.com too.
Awesome. I'm at JR Forasteros on Twitter, and probably in the last couple of years, the book that has been the most transformative for how I have been engaged in a public faith has been Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. It's a definitive history of racial ideas. It is like 700 pages long, and I would have read it if it was 1,400 pages long. It's just absolutely brilliant. I've been recommending it to everyone I can, so highly recommend it. So here's what we're going to do. We're at the end of this. We hope we take the conversation to Twitter. We've already seen a lot of you tweeting, sharing quotes, all of that. Thank you. This video will remain at this link, and you can share it, watch it, whatever you want to do. We're also going to create a landing page at norvalrogers.com, which is the website where Kathy and I's podcast, Fascinating Podcast, is hosted. That'll have all of the links to everyone's websites and everyone's books that they've written, plus the resources that have been recommended throughout the night. Every piece of information we can put will be at that landing page. We'll drop the link into the description of the video. We'll also put it in the Facebook group, and of course, we'll tweet it out so that hopefully tomorrow morning at the latest, you'll be able to get all of the resources that everyone has mentioned. I want to say thank you again to our incredible panel. Thank you for your generous gift of your time and your recommendations and your wisdom. It's been an absolute pleasure to have all of you on here. And thank you also to everyone who has been watching and engaging with us. We hope that this is just the beginning of the conversation. I hope that, because we barely got started. I have so many more questions and everything. So please, please, please continue this. Maybe we'll do one of these again sometime. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But for now, just thank you to everyone who has participated, and take care of yourselves out there. We will all be praying that the Spirit is really speaking clearly to you, and you can see how God's grace is compelling you to a beautiful public faith. So thank you again, and grace and peace be with all of you.